The barn smelled of rot and old money, the kind of rot that comes not from neglect but from time, from decades of weather pressing against wood that had simply decided it was done. Vivian Ashworth Cole stood at the edge of the property in a cream-colored coat that had no business being in a field. Her assistant 3 steps behind her with a tablet, and she looked at the thing in the center of the yard, the way a person looks at something they cannot believe still exists. That, she said, is a pile of lumber with a door attached to it. She was not entirely wrong. The structure, if it could be called that, was a collapsed timber frame barn on a parcel of land she had been trying to acquire for 14 months. The owner, a man named Eli Voss, had declined every offer. He ran a small repair shop at the edge of town called Voss & Co., a name that implied a partnership that no longer existed, and he drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it and a cracked passenger mirror he had never replaced. He had showed up to the meeting in work clothes, and Vivian Ashworth Cole, who was the founder and chief executive of Ashworth Development Group, and who had built her reputation on reading people in the first 30 seconds, had read him immediately. She had read him as someone who could be managed. She did not know that the barn she had dismissed as a pile of lumber had been built in 1887 by a craftsman whose joinery techniques were currently the subject of a doctoral dissertation at a school of architecture she had certainly heard of. She did not know that Eli Voss had spent 11 years as a master timber frame restorer for a firm in Vermont whose client list included 3 National Historic Preservation Trusts and a Smithsonian affiliate project. She did not know that he had walked away from that career deliberately and without regret because a 7-year-old girl named Maisie needed a father who came home at the same address every night. And because Claire was gone, and because some things matter more than the resume, stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. Eli Voss was 38 years old. He had a daughter named Maisie who was 7, who carried a small stuffed rabbit named Button everywhere she went, and who had a habit of asking questions that sounded simple until you sat with them for a moment. He had a shop with a hand-painted sign, a truck with a cracked mirror, and a barn that Vivian Ashworth Cole had just called a pile of lumber. He had not corrected her. He had simply stood there in the November grass with his hands in the pockets of his Carhartt jacket and watched her finish her sentence. And then he had looked at the barn the way a person looks at something they understand completely, which is to say, without urgency. His face was still. His hands were still. He had bought the parcel 3 years earlier, the year after Claire died, with the insurance settlement and what remained of the Vermont savings. The town was called Harwick, population 4,000, and it had the quality of a place that had stopped growing and made its peace with that. The shop was on Clement Street, 2 bays wide, with a pegboard wall where he kept his chisels and mallets in order, each one hanging on its own labeled hook, the handles worn dark and smooth to the shape of his grip. He did not advertise. He did not have a website. He charged fairly, and the people who needed him found him, and that was enough. Maisie came to the shop after school. She did her homework at a folding table near the back wall, Button propped against her pencil case, and she watched her father work with the focused quiet of a child who has grown up around careful things. She did not interrupt. She asked her questions at the end, when the tools were clean and hanging back on their hooks, and the sawdust had been swept into the corner. Claire had been gone for 3 years. Eli did not speak about her often, but the photograph on the shop's back shelf, Claire, at a timber frame raising in Vermont, laughing, sawdust caught in her hair, was never moved and never turned away from the light. He had learned in the years since that grief did not require maintenance. It simply lived in the room with you, quiet as a tool on a pegboard, present without demanding attention. The barn had been part of the parcel. He had known what it was the moment he walked it. The timber framing was white oak, hand-hewn, with mortise and tenon joinery cut to tolerances that modern machinery struggled to replicate. The principal rafters were still true. The sill plates had rotted at the bearing ends, which was expected and repairable. The rest of it, the posts, the tie beams, the braces, was intact beneath the collapsed roofing, waiting with the patience of material that has never had any reason to doubt itself. It was the kind of structure that rewarded looking. Most people did not look long enough. He had not listed the parcel for sale. He had not told anyone what he intended to do with the barn. He had simply let it sit and worked the shop and waited. Vivian Ashworth Cole had come to him through a broker named Terrence, who had described the parcel as a development opportunity and Eli as a motivated seller. Terrence had been wrong on both counts, but he was not the kind of person who updated his assessments. Vivian had made 3 offers in writing. Each one had been declined in 2 sentences. The sentences were polite and final, and Terrence had read them each time with the expression of a man who believes politeness is a negotiating position rather than an answer. She had come in person in November, and she had brought her assistant, and she had stood in the field in her cream coat and delivered her verdict on the barn, and Eli had listened without expression. "I'll tell you what," she said, and her voice had the particular brightness of someone accustomed to closing things. "If you can do something useful with that pile of wood by morning, I'll sign the deed over." She laughed. Not a loud laugh, a soft one, the kind that meant she was not really making an offer. Eli looked at the barn for a moment. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. She stopped laughing. He did not explain what he meant. He thanked her for coming out and walked back to his truck, and she stood in the field for a moment longer than she intended to, watching him go. And then she said something to her assistant that the assistant did not write down. Terrence called that evening to tell Eli that Vivian was not legally bound by anything said in a field, that it had been a joke, that no one was taking it seriously. Eli said he understood. He did not say anything else. He hung up and looked at Maisie, who was eating cereal at the kitchen table with Button sitting upright beside her bowl. And he said, "We're going to work tonight." Maisie looked up. "On the barn?" "On the barn." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Is it going to be fixed?" "It's going to be what it always was," he said. "We're just going to show it." She nodded as if this made complete sense, which to her it did. He called one person. His name was Denny Frick, and he had been Eli's apprentice in Vermont for 4 years before Eli left, and he had driven 2 hours without being asked twice. He arrived at 9 in the evening with his own tools and a canvas roll and a thermos of coffee, and he and Eli stood at the edge of the barn in the cold, and Denny looked at it for a long time without speaking. His breath came in small, even clouds. He tilted his head the way a person tilts their head when they are reading something written in a language they... He crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the base of the nearest post, feeling the grain through his fingertips, and he held that position for a moment before he stood again. "Tie beams are still good," Denny said finally. "All of them," Eli said. Denny nodded. He did not ask about the fee. He unrolled his tools on the tailgate, laying each one flat in the order he would need it. The slick, the paring chisel, the mallet, the brace, and the set of bits in graduated sizes, and they began. The first thing they did was clear the collapsed roofing. 3 hours of careful deconstruction, setting aside every piece of original material that could be salvaged, stacking it in order by dimension and condition on a tarp spread across the frozen ground. The fallen rafters came down by hand, 2 men working in sequence, one steadying while the other freed the bearing point, reading the structure as they went, understanding before they moved what each piece was doing and what would shift when it was gone. Eli worked with the kind of attention that looked, from the outside, like stillness. His hands moved and eyes moved, and the rest of him did not. Denny matched his pace without being told, the way a person matches the pace of music they have played before. By midnight, the frame was exposed. The white oak posts rose clean in the flashlight beam, the mortise and tenon joints tight after 137 years. The drawbore pegs still seated in their bored channels, the wood around them compressed and dark with age and dry as stone. Eli ran a finger along the shoulder of the nearest tenon, tracing the line where the original craftsman's chisel had pared the wood to its final dimension. The surface was glassy. The fit had not opened a fraction in a century and a third. The sill repairs took another 2 hours. Eli had pre-cut the replacement stock from air-dried white oak he kept racked in the back of the shop, each board tagged with its moisture content and cut date. And he fitted the new sill sections to the original dimensions with a shoulder plane and a float, working by feel in the flashlight's beam, testing the fit with his palm before he was satisfied. He did not use screws. He did not use adhesive. He bored the drawbore holes by hand with a brace and bit the same diameter as the original pegs, and drove the oak pegs home with a mallet. And the sound they made seating into the joint was a short, dense sound, the sound of 2 things becoming one thing, and it carried clearly in the cold air. At 3 in the morning, Maisie was asleep on the truck's back seat under a wool blanket, button tucked under her arm, the cab light on low. Denny poured coffee from the thermos, and they stood and looked at what the night had uncovered. The steam from the cups rose straight in the still air. Neither man spoke for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. The frame stood clear against the sky, every joint seated, every post plumb, the tie beams spanning the width of the structure in the exact geometry the original builder had intended. It was not restored. It was returned. The distinction mattered to Eli in a way he did not need to explain, because the barn itself explained it, standing there in the cold dark, with the patience of something that had always known what it was. At 5:47 in the morning, Eli Voss sent a single text message to Terrence. It contained 2 words and a photograph. It's done. The photograph showed the barn frame standing in the first gray light, plumb and clean, and exactly what it had always been. And it was the kind of image that required no caption, because the work spoke clearly enough for anyone who knew how to listen. Terrence did not respond immediately. He forwarded the photograph to Vivian Ashworth Cole at 6:12 in the morning. She was in her car, being driven to a breakfast meeting, and she looked at the image on her phone for longer than she intended to, and she said nothing to her driver. Vivian Ashworth Cole arrived at the parcel at 7:43 in the morning, her driver pulling the black car to the edge of the gravel lane while she sat in the back seat and looked through the window at the thing standing in the field. She did not get out immediately. She sat with the image for a moment, the way a person sits with something that has not resolved itself into a category yet, and her assistant, a young woman named Petra, who had worked for her for 2 years and who had learned to read her employer's silences the way a navigator reads weather, sat very still and did not say anything. What Vivian saw was the barn, not the ruin she had walked past in November, not the collapsed thing she had dismissed in 30 seconds with a line she had thought was a joke. What she saw was a timber frame standing plumb and clean in the early light, the white oak posts rising from their repaired sills with the kind of authority that old wood earns and never loses, the tie beams spanning the width of the structure in exact and unhurried geometry. It was not a restoration. It was something quieter than that. It was a structure that had simply been allowed to be what it had always been. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a performance and a fact. She got out of the car. Eli was standing near the frame with a cup of coffee, his Carhartt jacket open despite the cold, and Denny was packing tools into the canvas roll on the tailgate. Maisie sat on the running board of the truck, button in her lap, watching the adults with the patient attention of a child who has learned that important things happen slowly. Vivian walked across the frost-stiffened grass in shoes that were wrong for the ground, and she stopped a few feet from the frame and looked up at the nearest post, at the mortise joint where a principal rafter seated into the top plate with a precision that the original carpenter had cut by hand with a chisel and a mallet and a knowledge of wood that took years to build. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the post. The oak was cold and faintly rough under her hand, the adze marks still legible in the surface after 137 years. Each facet a record of a single stroke by a man whose name no one now remembered. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she lowered it. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I said something at the auction. I mean, in the field. It was unkind." Her voice had changed. It was not the bright, closing voice she had used in November. It was quieter, more careful. The kind of voice that arrives after a person has done some private recalculating and arrived at a number they had not expected. Eli looked at her. "You saw what you saw," he said. "I saw what I expected to see," she said. "That's different." He did not argue the point. He drank his coffee and looked at the frame, and she stood beside him and looked at it too. And for a moment, they were simply two people standing in a field looking at something that had survived 137 years and one November night of careful hands. She made him an offer then. Not for the parcel. She had understood by that point that the parcel was not for sale, but for a consultation on 3 historic structures her development group had acquired. In the past year, properties she had intended to demolish and rebuild, but which, she said, she was reconsidering. She named a figure. It was a serious figure. Ely listened to it without expression. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded. She had expected that. She handed him a card, which he took and put in his jacket pocket without looking at it, and she turned and walked back to the car, and Petra held the door, and the car pulled away down the gravel lane and was gone. Then he finished rolling his tools and snapped the canvas closed and looked at Ely. He did not say anything. He put the roll in his own truck and climbed in and drove away, and the sound of the engine faded into the cold morning air and left the field quiet. Maisie looked up from Button. "Is she going to come back?" "Maybe," Ely said. Maisie considered this. Then she looked at the barn frame, standing in the light the way it had stood for a century before either of them was born. "It looks like it was always there," she said. "It was," Ely said. She nodded, satisfied, and tucked Button more firmly under her arm. He stood there a moment longer in the frost and the quiet, and then he picked up his tools and loaded the truck. And he did not look back at the frame again because there was no need. The work was done. The barn knew what it was. That had always been enough. The card stayed in his jacket pocket for 3 days. He did not throw it away. Petra had recognized him before her employer did. That was how it had gone, and that was how it often went. And Petra had learned in 2 years of working for Vivienne Ashworth Cole that the most important information in any room was usually the information no one at the top of the room was looking for. She had recognized the name Voss from a preservation journal she had read during a long flight there. Previous spring, an article about a Vermont timber frame firm that had done the structural restoration of a covered bridge listed on the National Register, a project that had won a citation from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and that the article had credited in large part to a restorer named Ely Voss, whose work the author described as the kind of practice that keeps a craft from becoming a memory. She had not told Vivienne. It had not been her place, and Vivienne had not asked. But she had stood in the field that November morning and watched Ely Voss look at the barn. And she had seen in the quality of that look, unhurried, complete, the look of a person reading something in a language they were fluent in, exactly what her employer had missed. She had written nothing in her tablet. She had simply noted it, the way a person notes a thing they expect to need later. She needed it 3 days up the morning at the field, when Vivienne asked her to pull together everything she could find on Ely Voss before a follow-up call. Petra had the file ready in 40 minutes. The Vermont firm, the 11 years, the National Trust citation, the Smithsonian Affiliate Project, the patents, 2 of them, both related to mortise geometry in green oak framing, both filed before he was 32. The doctoral dissertation, which was currently in its 3rd chapter, and which cited his work 4 times in the first 2 chapters alone. She printed it and set it on Vivienne's desk in a plain folder without comment, the pages aligned, the edges square, the folder placed at the center of the blotter where it could not be overlooked. Vivian read the file at her desk and did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "He didn't say any of this." "No," Petra said. Vivian set the file down and looked at the window. "He didn't need to," she said. "It was not a question." "No," Petra said again. There was a silence in the office that was different from ordinary silence. The kind that comes after a person has revised a significant assumption and is still in the process of understanding the full extent of the revision. Vivian sat in it for a moment, and then she picked up her phone and made the follow-up call herself, which was not how she usually handled consultations at the preliminary stage. She dialed the number from the file rather than asking Petra to connect her. That detail was not lost on Petra, who noted it the same way she noted most things, quietly, completely, without remark. The secondary broker, Terrence, had not called Eli again after the morning at the field. He had forwarded the photograph and then gone quiet. And when his assistant asked him about the Harwick parcel 3 weeks later, he said the opportunity had resolved itself and moved on without elaborating. He was not invited to the follow-up meeting. He did not ask why. Eli drove home. In the early afternoon of the day Vivian made her offer, Maisie in the passenger seat with Button on her lap and her head tilted against the window, watching the fields go by. The truck's heater ran warm and the cracked passenger mirror caught the light at an angle that made it look briefly like something intentional. He did not stop at the shop. He drove past Clement Street and took the longer route home, through the part of town where the old houses sat back from the road behind bare November maples, their clapboards silver gray in the thin afternoon light, their foundations the same local stone as the barn's chimney base. And he let the truck run at the pace the road suggested. Maisie fell asleep before they reached the house. He carried her in from the truck the way he always did, Button still so tucked under her arm, her head against his shoulder, and he laid her on the couch and pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and covered her, and she did not wake. He stood in the quiet living room for a moment, looking at her, and then he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The photograph of Claire was on the shelf in the shop, not here, but he did not need to see it to know it was there. It was always there. Some things did not require maintenance. They simply continued, present and steady, like a well-cut joint in a frame that had been standing for 137 years and intended to stand for 100 more. He made his tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window where the last of the afternoon light was falling in a long rectangle across the floor, the way light falls when it has somewhere to be and is not hurrying to get there. The mug was warm in both hands. The house was quiet in the way a house is quiet when the person sleeping in the next room is someone you would do anything for. Outside, the garage light came on as the timer tripped, the way it did every evening at this hour, casting its familiar yellow circle on the gravel. He had not answered Vivian's offer. Not yet. He would think about it the way he thought about all things, carefully, without urgency, giving it the time it needed to become clear. That was how he worked. That was how he had always worked. Some things only reveal themselves to the people willing to look long enough. The kettle had gone quiet. The light held the floor. Maisie slept.